Okay, here we are again, students, at the beginning of a new week. It's week 4 now, right? But who's counting? Um, so we are starting to get away from Descartes, I guess we could say. So mainly we've just read things written exclusively by Descartes. And now I'm a little bit excited because we're reading this correspondence between Princess Elisabeth of Bohemia and Descartes, René Descartes. So we're starting to get new perspectives, new horizons at this point. The only things that we really need to keep in mind about the princess are that she's pretty well educated herself. She comes from money, she comes from royalty, and she's also got a lot of leisure time. She's got a lot of free time on her hands. Her family is in exile. So if her family were in power, you might expect her to have some royal duties, right? But she is living in exile, so she's got money, she's got tutors, she's got free time, right, on top of all that. So she's got a lot of time to think about philosophy. Obviously, she's interested in it, and she spends a lot of time pondering. And so she's got lots of time to think about Cartesian philosophy and how well it works and where it might not work. So she's a good correspondent. I enjoy these letters between the two of them. She's a good foil for Descartes. She comes up with some good criticisms. Okay, so I'm going to do 2 lectures on the correspondence. You might have noticed there's a break in the letters, as we have them here at least. So there are these letters from 1643, and they're pretty heavy on metaphysics. And then there are letters from 1645 and 1646, and the topics are very different in those letters. So those letters are on ethics, I would say. They cover virtue and the good life, and there are some metaphysical issues there, but the metaphysical issues are sort of driven by the ethical discussion, right? So this lecture is going to be on the 1643 letters, and so I don't think it'll be very long, but you know I'm not very concise. And then the next lecture will be on the letters from 1645 and 1646. Okay, so on page 170, right away, Princess Elisabeth does a great job of raising the problem of mind-body interaction, right? She states the problem very clearly as any contemporary person could. Basically, she says, when I think about how motion is initiated, right, it seems like there's always body involved. How does something get moved? How does a body get moved in general? Well, another body sets it into motion. Usually that seems like the typical case, right? And that tends to happen through physical contact, right? If I want to move this notebook in front of me, I have to touch it and lift it up, right? I have to use physical contact. She also notes that the form of a physical body could set it into motion. So a wheel, for instance, it has a round form. So under the right circumstances, its physical form will at least contribute to its moving, to its being set into motion, right? So whatever kind of case we look at in which something is set into motion, if we set aside the case of the mind setting the body into motion, since we don't understand it that well, that's the one we're trying to understand. If we set that aside, it seems like a body is set into motion through extension, through other bodies, or through the formation of its own extension, right? So if there's movement, or there's the initiation of movement, there's extension involved, right? So that, of course, creates a puzzle. How can the mind, which is not extended, which is not a body, set a body into motion? So basically, Elisabeth says, I don't see how that could work, Descartes. Would you care to elaborate? Right? That's the opening of their conversation. All right, so Descartes' response involves these primitive notions. Now here his rationalism seems to come into play, right? These primitive notions seem fairly abstract when he actually names some of them. So there are primitive notions pertaining to body alone, primitive notions pertaining to mind alone, and then there are primitive notions pertaining to the mind-body union. With respect to body, Descartes mentions extension and duration. Now, we've already seen in the meditations our understanding of those is a rational understanding. It's not based on the senses. So from a rationalist point of view, Descartes is saying thought, pure thought, non-sensual thought, is elaborated from a basic set of concepts. There has to be a bottom. I mean, we know there are complex concepts, so Descartes is just making the logical point that there has to be a set, let's say, of most basic concepts, and then taking that for granted, they can be divided into these three broad categories. Some pertain to mind, some pertain to body, some pertain to the mind-body union. His first argumentative move after having established that is, look, there's a basic notion of power. I mean, I don't know that he actually explicitly says it's basic, but he does say there's this notion of power, right? One body has the power to move another. It transfers motion, we could say, right? What we tend to do is we confuse bodily power and mental power, right? So Descartes seems to be indirectly saying Elisabeth is confused, right? Because he's saying we, human beings, we tend to make this confusion. We tend to do this. We look at how a body has a power to create motion in another body, and we project that onto minds. And so when we think about the power of minds, we end up using the basic notion that applies to bodies, right? And basically he says, well, don't make that mistake, right? The way that the mind sets a body into motion is different from the way a body sets a body into motion. I mean, that's fine, but that doesn't tell us anything positive. Then things get a bit weird, honestly. So Descartes says on page 172, if you want to check this out, he says, our thinking of heaviness as a real quality, so he's suggesting it's not a real quality, shows we have a notion of contactless force or power, right? And we could appropriately apply that to the way the mind sets the body into motion. That's a weird argument, right? So he's saying, here's a misapplied notion, right? We think of heaviness as an actual bodily quality. We don't want to get into Cartesian metaphysics here. We could have a digression on why he thinks heaviness isn't a real quality and why bodies act the way they do without a theory of gravitation, right? Newton comes after Descartes, so Descartes isn't working with a theory of gravitation. So why do bodies fall toward the Earth, and why does the Earth orbit the sun? I mean, we could get into that, but that doesn't seem like a good idea. What we do need to understand is the focus on heaviness is occurring here because, well, there's no contact, right? An object is drawn toward another object, and there's no contact going on, right? And then that leads us to say, oh, object A is heavy, and it's going downward. And he's saying that's not correct according to my understanding of physics, but at the same time, that shows that we do have a notion of one thing. I almost said body. One thing, one substance, setting another into motion without contact. The notions there apply it to the mind-body problem. Okay, so how does Elisabeth respond to that weirdness? And I'm not saying Descartes' argument is no good, just that was an odd take on it, but it works to some extent. I'll leave you to think about whether it completely works, but it was a decent response to what Elisabeth said. How does she respond to his response? Well, she says, my idea of an immaterial substance, such as the mind, the soul, is merely negative. So I don't know how to think about the mind positively, right? And it's easier to think about the soul as extended than to think of something non-extended setting matter into motion. Or to put it a little differently, again, my idea of the mind is it's not extended. I don't have a positive idea of a power that the mind has that would allow it to affect bodies. So then it's easier for me to think of the soul as extended, and then I can see how the soul would set bodies into motion, right? So I'm using what I know. I know bodies can set other bodies into motion. I don't know what kind of power the mind has to set a body into motion. So shouldn't I construe the mind is extended, and then I know how it can do this thing that it seems to do? I have an experience of my mind setting my body into motion. I don't know how it works, but if I think of my mind as extended, then I can see how it works. That's a really good response from Elisabeth, right? Okay. So going back to Descartes, then how is Descartes going to deal with this? He's got a real issue here. I'm not sure he realizes the gravity of the problem. Can't help but make an allusion to gravity at this point. Maybe he doesn't know what a hole he's in here with mind-body interaction. But anyway, what he says is, look, we understand the mind clearly and distinctly on its own. We understand the body clearly and distinctly on its own. He said that in the Meditations already. What's surprising here is he says, things pertaining to the mind-body union are known. That's the word he uses. Are known clearly by the senses alone, the understanding or the intellect can only grasp the mind-body union obscurely. Now, he did suggest that also in the meditations, that the intellect grasps the union in an obscure way, and these obscure ideas arise, like color. Color was said to be a confused idea, right? And it has something to do with the mind-body union, and that's what makes it confused. But he says quite clearly here that the senses are able to know the mind-body union. That's surprising coming from him. I wouldn't have thought the senses could know anything. But the senses do fill a gap between mind and body. Remember the discussion about the imagination in the sixth meditation, right? Bodies can be imagined, and when we imagine them, we have certain sensory thoughts that correspond to extended bodies. So the imagination takes up this sort of mediating position. So even though I'm kind of surprised that Descartes would say that the senses know the mind-body union, it is compatible with what he said in the sixth meditation. I don't think there's a contradiction here. So to continue the surprise, he says, so when I just live my life and I engage in ordinary conversations, then I grasp the union as well as I can. Study won't help, right? So study and thinking closely about the problem with the intellect isn't going to help. It's an interesting thing for Descartes to say. It's when you live your life that you understand the mind-body union, and he actually suggests to Elisabeth, don't spend too much time in your study. You got to let your mind relax, and you got to go about your day-to-day business. Otherwise your thinking gets narrowed and inflexible. Some of that comes up in the other set of correspondence, but some of it comes up here. Descartes also concedes that it's okay. You can do it, Elisabeth. It's okay to think of the soul as extended. Then you're just thinking of the soul united to the body. However, there is a conception of the soul all by itself, and that's pure thought. Okay, so is that a good response? I mean, ultimately you have to decide on your own, by yourself, but it seems like, from a broad point of view here, taking the big picture view, Elisabeth pointed out a really difficult problem in Descartes' system, and Descartes at least started to address it, but then one of his main points was just, don't look too closely at the problem, just walk away from your studies and live your life, and then you'll get the idea. I mean, is that a good response to a conceptual and theoretical problem that's been raised? You might think so, right? But yeah, that certainly could seem problematic. And Elisabeth's final response, and this bit of correspondence is pretty. It's tight and it's sharp, right? It's a good response. So on page 175, Elisabeth says, look, the soul moves the body. Let's take that for granted, That's our experience, right? I have a thought. My intention to move my hand is a thought, and my hand moves as a result of the intention. So my experience is that the soul does move the body, but I don't know how. And so this leads me to attribute extended qualities to the soul, right? I don't clearly see that the soul is extended. However, I don't clearly see how the soul can move the body either. And I know that extension can move extension. Extended body can move extended body. So we're back to this point. Shouldn't I construe my soul is extended? That'll fix the problem. Elisabeth plays Descartes against Descartes, which is pretty nice. She brings up the fourth meditation. Descartes made this rule in the fourth meditation: don't form judgments except on the basis of CDPs. Right? If you don't have a CDP, if you don't have a relevant CDP, just suspend your judgment. That's the best thing to do. So on the one hand, we could just suspend our judgment and say, we don't know anything about the mind moving the body, but that's not very satisfying. Again, clearly the mind moves the body. If we're going to use relevant CDPs, well, we do CDP that extension can move extension. So let's construe the soul as extended, and then we'll understand how it can move the body. That's pretty good. We don't have any further responses from Descartes. If he were to respond, he would definitely double down on this idea that when we conceive the mind on its own, we conceive it as thought, and thought doesn't involve extension. So when we think about how thought moves the body, we cannot bring extension into it. Okay, well, we'll stop there. It's an interesting back and forth. I'm not going to try to resolve the issues. Elisabeth made some really good points, so these are things we should think about with her. All right, thank you.